Okay, everybody. Good evening, everybody, and welcome back with a fresh start in 2018 and the continuation of our Sliver lecture series titled Positions. The lecture series this year depicts individual perspectives within our professional and academic context by former IoA graduates and alumni. The Angewandte is celebrating its 150-year anniversary, and we are proud to look back, but also forward to architects who constantly shape and influence our built environment and thinking about space at large. We have heard presentations and discussions of graduates who push the boundaries of our discipline and have become role models for today's student generation. In the past sessions, we invited graduates who work within academia and research, and in the last session, we have tackled issues of career paths from the start and the challenges for practicing architects today. We continue with a series with the title Built, Unbuilt, with two distinguished guests, Marie-Therese Harnoncourt and Barbara Imhof. Before giving you a short introduction to them, I have to forward an apology from Carlo Baumschlager, who was scheduled for this session, but due to unforeseen circumstances, had to cancel his attendance. We're looking forward today to two positions within the extremes. Two architects who operate outside the spectrum of conformity and nominality of the architectural practice. In a way, one could say that a conceptual education, which is inherent to the Institute of Architecture in the past and in the present, aims at producing cultural leaders who, through spatial artifacts, buildings, or research, challenge our perception and understanding of the world itself, or in some cases, even expand it. Both of our guests today give true examples of leaning their work towards this challenge. We have mentioned collaborative modes of practice in our last session, and I think we will engage also today on this topic, but from a very different angle. Collaboration can happen on many levels, I think, but a contemporary practice always needs to lean outside of the window, outside of the profession itself, to find its momentum that drives the project and the work. Interdisciplinary, or rather dissolving the disciplinary boundaries, is how I would like to define what describes best and relates our two guests today, even if their work spatially lies sometimes light years apart. Our two guests today are no strangers to this institution due to their constant input and research efforts. After my brief introduction, we will have two presentations followed by a short conversation with questions from my side and then questions by the audience. Marie-Therese Harnoncourt is a graduate of the University of Applied Arts, Masterclass Wolf Prix, 1993, and founder of the Next Enterprise Architects in 2000 together with Ernst Fuchs. From the beginning, they have operated in a field that ranges from experimental installations to architectural practice, treating both approaches as equal and mutually influential. Projects like the Cloud Tower OpenAir Pavilion and Cloud No. 9 Catering Pavilion in Grafenegg, Lakeside Bath in Calderau, the House in Ziel, Fidessa Retz, and the AZM Mainz in Germany have been widely exhibited and published. Their exhibitions have been shown among others at Archilab in Orléans, the Biennale in Sao Paulo, the AEDES Gallery in Berlin, the Manifesta in Italy, several attendances and participations in the Venice Biennale, the Architekturforum in Tirol, or the Mackie Garages in Los Angeles. Since 1998, Marie-Therese has held teaching appointments at several universities. Of course, at the University of Applied Arts, the Technical University, the École Spatiale d'Architecture in Paris, and she's currently a member of the advisory board of Art for BIG and member of the board of trustees Stiftung Forum Morgen since 2017. Barbara Imhof is an internationally active space architect, design researcher, and educator who was also graduated from the Masterclass Prix in 1996, prior to education at the Technical University, the Bartlett School of Architecture, and SciArc Los Angeles. Barbara Imhof has a Master of Science from the International Space University in Strasbourg and received her doctorate from the TU Vienna. Her projects deal with spaceflight parameters, such as with living with limited resources, minimal and transformable spaces, resource-conserving systems, all aspects imperative to sustainability. She is the co-founder and CEO of Liquefier System Group, an interdisciplinary team comprising of engineers, architects, designers, and scientists. Projects include the design for the first transportable European space simulation habitat called SHE, the design of sampling tools for human-robot collaboration on Project Moonwalk, and adding to her experience about space simulation, she served as a simulation astronaut for the Project Moonwalk's Mars demonstration in Rio Tinto, Spain in 2016. Another path that Barbara has been following since the 2000s are biomimetic designs for architectural structures, such as in the projects Bioornomatics and Growing as Building. Liquefier partners and clients belong to internationally renowned institutions and space agencies. Since nearly 20 years, Barbara Imhof has been teaching at various prestigious universities, such as the ETH Zurich, Chalmers University Göteborg, the University of Applied Arts, of course, and the Technical University in Vienna. Since 2015, she has been serving on the board of directors for Women in Aerospace. Since 2016, she's an executive board member. She has received numerous awards for her work, most recently in 2016 as Austrian of the Year for her research activities. So without further ado, please welcome first Marie-Therese Harnoncourt with her lecture.
So thank you very much for the invitation and for the introduction. It's great being here, and it's exactly 25 years since I did my diploma here. It's quite a long time, and it was also in January when I had my diploma at Wolf-Briggs Glass. I started actually, and I think maybe it's of interest to go back a bit. I started first at Johannes Spalt Glass for interior design, and was then changing to architecture, and was a bit at Hans Hollein Glass, and had the opportunity when Wolf took over the glass of Johannes Spalt to really be part of these first years of Wolf being in this, starting his Meisterklasse, the Angewandte. It was a very dense atmosphere, and Wolf was opening up this very rigid system, which was the Angewandte. Before, he was inviting people to reviews. We're doing excursions and exchange programs to Sayak and to Milan, and so it was a lot of things going on, and there were also new tasks and items that we were working on, like Raumabdruck or like Labor, where we should find out ourselves what we want to research. So there were a lot of new things that were started through Wolf's being here. Okay. So when I did my diploma, so old pictures, it was I was already dealing with with zones under the motorway. It was all about abandoned space that should be available for people to appropriate. Something that we went on also later on. I also wanted to show the diploma of Ernst, because we are working together, and I think he also should be part of the discussion. Ernst was doing a house, a starting point for urban development in Süßenbrunn, and he developed this house out of film sequences. That was the first, this development process of designing. And on the other hand, it was the first house on site, which during the growth of the surrounding then in the end turned into a park. So already this kind of flexible houses as flexible elements to activate urban situations was already starting to grow, and is also something we are still working on. So after working with Stephen Halls in New York for a year, which was really exciting and interesting, and I also, of course, did a tour to all the land art in California and seeing the double negative and Walter de Maria and a lot of other things, which was, I think, very important for me. I decided to go back to work, to go on working with the so-called group of former students of Wolf, like Wolfgang Grillitsch and Florian Heyden and Ernst Fuchs, called the Poor Boys Enterprise. And we were all looking for an architecture that is intense and that is motivating to do something. And we were looking for this kind of architectural answers. Where does architecture start? What can architecture do in the street? The city was our sketchbook, and we were doing installations or just markings within the city and trying to find answers to these questions. We were dealing a lot with language. We were dealing with what function means in architecture. This is the project 97 Chairs, which was started in New York and then went also to Vienna. It was a project for us, an urban project, where all these ideas about identity, language in architecture, what function means in architecture, in the end was written in a book, fragments of all these thoughts, which was called The Picking of the City, translated, Die Beute Stadt. We did together with Bernhard Winkler, who was also studying at the Angewandte. He was the one who was always standing at the copy machine all day long. And it's a book where you can read in different directions. It was all about associative reading, about neutral fields where an image and a text and a number and things that overlap are inspiring. Of course, we also did good parties, always taking a moment to do something. Eisrinde number 1, we reused the Hirnsegelplane we had from the Hirnsegel space and did, I think, 20-meter long bar where all the drinks were already in the bag. My first realization within the group was the Dachausbau in Graz. It was actually a social housing. That means it was funded with reduced budget. It had to be in these limits of social housing. But important was to have the entering to the different apartments, which is a communal balcony on the one hand side, and on the other hand side also have additional areas that can be adapted by the people to put a chair to sleep up there. So for us it was always important that the user can use or find possibilities to inhabit the space. Ernst finished the Zierlhaus. It was actually this process of the neutral field that started already at the student, also already in the studio of Wolf Brix. And it was a design process. I do not want to explain at the moment. I just want that you feel what kind of different thematics we were dealing with. It was the process of design was something what interested us a lot. And out of this abstract machine or block with a lot of information, in the end this house was shaped out, and there were to these abstract machines there were local parameters, context cut into this mass, which made what shall I say, which made this this house connected very strongly to the context. In this case, it was the shadow of the surrounded houses you still can see, and which splitted the house in a shadowed and a non-shadowed area. It means that all these operations also were leading to special qualities within the house. You can see here. The first project we did in 2000 as the next enterprise was Stadtwind. It was a white spot, a leftover space that we wanted to activate, and it was called Urban Breeze, and I can read it because it was a former abundant fruit store, vegetable store, that was for us our disposal for 2 weeks, and we stood in this space which had lost its original function as a street front grocery. This apparent lack of function is pleasant, emancipating the space from the belief that it must function. It entices one to add something to the space to function. It entices one to add something to the space to blow in infiltrating material that activates this exceptional state and transforms it into an urban environment. The glass entrance is to be removed, the wind is channeled into the interior of the space. The vacated greenery grocery changes into a space that catches the wind. It is the urban breeze that carries him away like a dream. A little bit of poetic, maybe, but it all means that in the end, it's all about the user who defines what is public and what is private, in this case, for this installation. Another white spot, which means actually empty space, is the Blindgänger, which is a space containing fans. We did for a cultural site in Lower Austria, and these fans, we had this idea that these fans should also be an additional space that is 24 hours open for the public, but though can be used also for this cultural site. Because we said you shouldn't close down a cultural site, and therefore it was connected with the public lighting so that you could, so that it's part of the street system in the end. The underground swimming pool, which is an off space of a villa in the 19th district. The installation audio lounge was the first one we transformed. We used the computer to transform and to generate an object. And I want to show a little film we did. Also Johannes Mücke, Mark Hoffenscher, who were also students from Wolf's Class in former time. So there was a kind of associative talk Ernst and me had on the internet, where we said it shouldn't have an up and down, endless deep holes where you're swallowed, where you get thirsty for audio, because it should be an audio installation for an exhibition at the Secession. And we didn't want to do something with headphones, and we wanted to do something where you get spatially involved. These are the different interviews, and of course, if you went close to the holes, you could precisely hear the interview. If you were farther away, it was more a murmuring of the hole. And here you see it was a very easy concept you could do with a standard program, taking a sphere, because no up and down, defining parts or fields for the interviews, and then deforming the whole audio lounge. That's It defined suction points and then it was deformed. And in the end, the audio lounge was cut, which was interesting because this perfect computer-generated element had to be cut, had different reasons. And for us, it though opened up also this kind of enclosed computer form. And I think there's very often this problem when you generate or develop something on the computer that in it, it's a system in itself. And if you start to cut it or you manage, to put it in different contexts. So coming from the music to another music machine, which is a building, where a building is an instrument and was generated by the rules of doing a natural acoustics on the one hand side, on the other hand side by the rules or by the situation of landscape gardens, which is thinking in sequences and movement. And this is the OpenAir Pavilion in Grafenegg. And it's a space where you don't know where the building is ending or if it's a building or if it's not a building. Here you see the side from the stage, which the stage is something where for us it was important that you can look into the sky. This is the backstage area, nobody knows, but it's also can be used also for backstage, but also for any other parties or operations. And for us it was important, this sequence, walking through the park, also walking through this installation, that you have this feeling of entering. So if there's a venue, you're entering, you're getting into a space, though you're outside the whole time, having this situation of the concert. And we were very lucky because it is a very good acoustic. Everyone was nervous, but when the first tests were done by the orchestra, everyone was happy because the acoustic is really good. So you see it in a filled situation, but it's open the whole year, and it's also just a pavilion in the park. And for us it was important that all these elements also can be used for other activities. Here the children love to slide down. Topography in an urban context or the surrounding that is like generating or becomes part of the generating of the building is for the archaeological center in Mainz. And it's on the one hand the urban situation, a park, a standard building situation on the right hand side, and the close connection to the inner city, which we were overlapping on the side, which and splitted the program in 3 parts, which had a topographical part, had a standard building, and in the end an open free structure building, which is connected to the inner city and is also a kind of walkway from the city into the building. And the exhibition, which is for archaeological exhibition, so elements and objects. And as there are a lot of archaeological sites in Mainz, you can also, through wandering around, you can also have a look onto the city. So this walkway through this building, which is starting outside and leading you inside of the building and being in between the city and the building. And this connecting of program and space is something where we think this activating of outdoor space can happen like this. In a bigger urban context, Verteilerkreis Favoriten, we also started to activate a leftover space, which is the inside the island of a roundabout, with programmatic and spatial connection to the surrounding. And the programmatic connection, we also call it hybrid Stadtbausteine, I don't want to translate it. We're using program from the surrounding and putting it onto the island and trying to this mixed structure to activate also this, this at the moment leftover space within this traffic roundabout. And the thematic of reprogramming an existing monofunctional building or area was part of or interest of our Biennale project, where the former Siemens Hauptzentrale was turned into an active urban concept. The existing office structure should be used for temporary living, which means that of course the surrounding is changing if suddenly an office area started to become active and over the whole day and the whole week. And it's very interesting to see how these small steps of transformation that were done are really changing this surrounding in, I would say, in a kind of small scale situation, but so you can see there were a lot of analysis about the urban context, and everything has to do for the very close surrounding and trying to transform needs from the outside also onto the site. You have to know that, of course, for the Biennale we should find living facilities for refugees, and this was, of course, also a very problematic political situation, and therefore giving the surrounding a benefit to house refugees there was an important argument for the people and the surrounding also to be positive about the project. So the former building was very enclosed and as an office building, and we started a kind of promenade and opened up this park just on a small entrance area, but you have to know it's a private property, and if people go there in a private property, the owner has to, if something happens, he has to, it's a problem for him, and therefore it was a great that he did it, that he opened the garden up. In the upper floor, 4th and 5th floor, we did this concept for the Havi, which is a room-in-room concept. It was just this idea that the existing office situation is like a leftover space, and we imply something which is for the private and for sleeping and having all your private facilities, but all the surrounded area can be occupied or inhabited by the users. So it should be an experimental living, an offer not just for students and refugees, it also should be an offer for any person that is interested to try out a different kind of community living for a certain time. And we are also very interested or working on possibilities to transform this kind of system, or I would say the whole situation of the Siemens areal that at the moment developed as a, let's say, as a reprogramming of something existing, to use this kind of programming or development to think about what would happen if you remove the old building and put all this program into a new envelope. And we think that this space in space concept and has also a kind of political power, because having just a bed is very different to owning a space and that you can operate with this space within surrounding. And this student housing with 140 students is still active at the Kempelen Park. Okay, I go on. We are also interested in, with the new medias, how you can connect information and space. And the installation Nucleus, we were trying to put information from Niederösterreich in a kind of act of transformation onto the skin of an object, and then reading this information through mobile phones and tools. And for us it's interesting how can we connect, with digital, with all these equipments and possibilities we have, though with kind of spatial qualities. Because wandering around, finding out is more exciting than maybe sitting just on the computer. And it has a lot to do also with escapes for learning and things like this. And I think it's an interesting, we shouldn't lose through all the medias the space. And I think therefore it's interesting to go on with concepts like this. The competition for the university here I like to show, because it should be an addition to existing buildings that is opening up the complex, and that is adding something that is giving also a new space system to the existing one, because you have from 3 different centuries space offered, and I think that's a big potential to have different spatial qualities here. Of course, the heart that we were planning will not be built, and here you can see how this addition was put into the courtyard, and an additional tower also to the ring, because I think it's important that there's also something shown to the ring, and for us the connection with the MAC and using this open area of the MAC and also the facilities of the MAC together with the university would be a good step in the right direction. This is just a little project, also an addition in a 25 square meter space, which is Salon Lis, which is very compact, but though with illusion, working with illusion and dissolving the space. The kite and lakeside bath I'm showing because this overlapping of function is something we think is very interesting and or important for architecture. And here you can see the street situation, the circulation around the lake, and the bath, which is nearly like a plaza, which can be used for the swimming people, but also for the people going around and having also a drink at the bar and looking at the sea and the lakeside. And it's not blocked, so you can appreciate the situation without being inside. And so the whole concept was to add additional qualities to a very nice, already nice existing venue and site for swimming at Kaltern, and through this enlarged deck situation or plaza, the sun deck, we had on the one hand side a lifted area where you had a completely new view to the situation around. On the one hand side, on the other hand side, you had underneath we call it aquarium, covered situation with enclosed additional spaces for additional possibilities to use. Here you can see the steps for sunbathing also can be used for venues, for cultural events, and they are doing it and enjoy it. And meanwhile, they even did events underneath. And here you see this body. It's actually a huge sculpture casted out of concrete. Also this itself, it is a experimental building to produce this. And underneath you have different kind of atmospheric situations and connections to up and down and surround. And we also like in this public situation to have this very intimate and close and atmospheric spaces like this rain room and the whirlpool room. Atmospheric elements are atmospheric. To test what you can do with atmospheric elements, we also like to do also with installations. Like here at the Winter Palais, where we put an object in the rooms of Prince Eugen, and it was like through touching the object, there was an interaction, a kind of drawing done on the ceiling, and it was a context to the Baroque ceiling drawings from Prince Eugen that always glorify, Prince Eugen, and this was a kind of drawing that was done by the people in one-to-one. To imply atmosphere into spaces, we are testing also in exhibition spaces. The last exhibition we did, and we started to do more and more exhibitions, but it's also a kind of testing possibility, which I think is very interesting, was for Wien von oben, which is an exhibition which is dealing with cards and with views onto Vienna. And we did a kind of three-dimensional system, raster system, because you have it with GPS, but you also have it with maps. And we were trying to involve the whole space with it, because we have also this grid on the ceiling, and we tried to make it kind of very, let's say, that everything is carried by this kind of structure and makes it very light in the end, and a very open space that you really can concentrate on these very nice objects. Yeah, and this is the pavilion we did 1 year ago in Grafenegg, and I think very soon we also should make an alumni meeting there to drink something under this roof. And I say thank you, and I hope I was not too long.
Good evening. Pulp Flats in a Blurred Oasis. This was the title of my diploma project, and if you know a little bit about the 1990s, you also know that it's a very clear and strong reference to Britpop. It's a housing project. It's set in London, Clerkenwell, because I studied at the Bartlett before I came to the Studio Prix. I was still quite influenced from my time there. But what I also took on from the studio and from the exploration in the studio was to think about how will we be living in the future. And so I was especially interested in housing, in how we will live in 50 years, 20 years, and what kind of societies will these be. Because I always thought that when we define the societies or the social interaction, that also the space will change accordingly. So any kind of new forms of living together will also come to a new form of housing. So that was 1996. But already then I was thinking a little bit of how could these spaces be in 2046. So I invented scenarios, user-driven scenarios with different kinds of users, people who live together in a more larger family, like a tribe, the symbionts, people who are more parasitic or more individuals who dock onto existing structures, and people who live in the complete virtual space, the cybernauts and the trinks, the triple income no kids. So there was all these kinds of different users, and then I thought that after 50 years they would have all merged and come together, and boundaries are blurred and new social forms have arrived. But what I also was interested in is in seeing the virtual and the real space becoming one. And through these kind of thinking about, how can we live in many years, and when you think it further, then inevitably you have to think about how we will be living on the moon, on Mars, in the universe, on a space generation, on a generation spaceship, and how will be our social interaction in the spaces will look like. So through this investigation, I got a grant for the International Space University, where I did my master course. It was I didn't know what I would learn there, and it was I think I have to say it was an interdisciplinary course. We were 35 people from 30 different countries in the world, and with I believe maybe 20 different backgrounds. And as part of this, I had the opportunity to go for an internship to Johnson Space Center, to NASA, which was at that time very exciting. It was the shuttle Mir mission, so where the space shuttle on a regular monthly basis flew to the Mir space station, the Russian space station. And so Johnson Space Center was the hub for the astronaut training. I was engaged in a project which was called Bioplex. That's meant to be, or was meant then to be, a test facility on Earth to train astronauts for future missions for Mars. It was a set as a 5-module, you can see that on the top right-hand corner, 5-module facility, and with an interconnecting tunnel comprising of 2 greenhouses, a laboratory, and a habitat. So my investigations were more into how to create, with these very limited space, but also predefined space of these cylindric modules, because they were actually already in the building of this facility, to create a little bit more spaces where functions overlap, so similar to what Marie-Therese said right before, and also to make them more transformable so that they can be used in more different ways. So very simple, small interventions. This was the aim. After the Space University, I came back to Vienna, and some people always wondered why. But I think because I had already spoken to Sandrine von Claude, who also studied here at Wolf Prick's studio, and we had somehow arranged, while she was in LA and I was in Houston, that we would start an office together. And we took on board Birgit Tränkwalder. She was, I knew her from my studies at the Technical University, and we started an office. And I'd like to show 2 projects which are somehow representative of our work. One is back projection. It's a project which we initiated. So we had we worked in in a very experimental architectural base, on a very experimental architectural basis. So this was an installation out of cardboard, what you see on the left-hand side, in a German museum before, and we wanted to take that on and connect it to the virtual space. So what we suggested to Gerfried Stocker at the Ars Electronica Festival to build that, and the Future Lab helped us programming the interface, the online interface. So the idea was that there's actually a space, a real space, which was represented by these two movable panels, and which could be connected to a virtual platform. So on the internet, this was 2001, together with the Future Lab, we designed and programmed a game surface, which was a representation of the space we originally envisioned to build. So when I would move the panels here, somewhere, if a gamer would sit in Tokyo, that person would see that something is happening, and then if that person on that with that game surface would play this game, the panels here would move. So it was an equal. There were two on an equal level. The real and the virtual were connected. So this was one aspect, which was more an artistic work, and the other one was a very what architects do here in Vienna when they start offices, remodeling. This was an invited competition, which we won, was by the Social Democratic Party, who runs the EGA, a women, a center for women, women affairs, for gathering, for discourse. And I think the two aspects which are probably the most important is the opening up to the street. So this is on the left-hand side, that's the street facade. It's in Windmühlgasse and in the 6th district here in Vienna. And the other part was there were more like intimate meeting spaces or smaller meeting spaces in the front part of the house, and then there was a courtyard, or there is a courtyard, and in the back there is a little auditorium suitable also for panel discussions or theater plays or whatever you want to do there, with a little bar. So the other interaction, which is quite important and which is still used for their summer events, summer festivals up to today, is that we installed this roof which gave an outside space to the inside community space. At the same time, so this was between 1997 and 2002. At the same time, I started teaching at the Technical University, and it's important because this was the Institute for Building and Construction with Helmut Richter. And firstly, against strong headwind, I have to say, but later on, I think everybody was okay with that. I started introducing space design studios. The most successful was what you can see here, the Lunar-Based Design Workshop, where we initiated a workshop at the European Space Agency Space and Technology Center in Leiden. We gathered enough money to invite an Apollo astronaut, Harrison Schmitt, because we thought, we have to have, if you want to design something for the moon and we can't go ourselves to inspect the site, we at least have to bring someone who has been to the moon to us to tell us about the site, which was at that time a little bit of a crazy idea, but we somehow managed to, it's a little side story, to persuade the TV broadcasting station Endemol to pay so much money that we could fly in Harrison Schmitt from the US to teach the students. And then we had, of course, all the resources at the Space Technology Center and the experts coming to that workshop. And I think also that was the first time when the European Space Agency got aware of the fact that there could be space architects in Europe. And with this, I think I got interested in also taking Ian to practice space design and space architecture in a well, not only teaching way, but also in a professional working way with real contracts. And I got together with Susmita Mohanty, who I got to know who have been friends since the International Space University days, and with who I also spent a lot of time in Houston, and with Waltraud Hoheneder, who is right there. And she's also a BRICS graduate, so you see somehow we stick together over a long time. And we started Liquifer Systems Group. And the idea was to gather a team of engineers and architects and have this group to take on these very complex space projects. So one of the first persons who joined is actually another architect. It's René sitting there. And then I see Molly over there. So there are a couple of people from the core team present here. And our mission is that we don't draw a line between Earth and space, that space is around us, that we are in space. And so we extended the operational architectural field to the International Space Station, Moon, Mars, and of course we include our spaceship too. So I'd like to present a few projects, but I think the most important one, and Benze already mentioned it in the introduction, is the self-deployable habitat for extreme environments. This is our main business is looking or having a context, an environment which is very extreme. It's very hot. It's very very cold. It could be very without air, without or just not sufficient air, and without gravity. So the SHE habitat is a simulation facility which is built for Earth to test and train astronauts. It's a small facility, so it's not as big as Bioplex, the project I worked on at NASA, but it's a transportable test bed. And it was conceived so that ideally, if you would develop it further, you could have it as a research station in the Antarctic, so as an autonomous research station, or you could have it as a high-tech unit in case of any disasters. After we had finished building it, we were quite lucky to bring it to Rio Tinto. It's in Andalusia, in south of Spain, and as you can see, it looks a little bit like Mars, and it's one of the Mars analogs. So it's an internationally accepted or Mars analog site, which means it resembles specific features which allows you to test Mars simulations in a good way or in an appropriate way. And we brought it as SHE into another project, Moonwalk, which was about the cooperation of astronaut and a small helper rover. So this is still nearly finished in the building stage. And what the special thing is that it's quite small. It's 28 square meters. It's built for 2 people to live in there for 2 weeks autonomously. It has a 50 cubic meters, so a volume which is sufficient to actually, when you think about to recycle the air, you need at least 25 cubic meters per person. And it has a diameter of 6 meters. So it could also fit into a rocket, a heavy lift launcher, which can bring you to the moon or to Mars. And from an architectural perspective, it's you can see on the right-hand side that everything's super collapsed. So it all needs to be transformable, and it's really, everything is stowed away. So actually when it's in this stowed configuration, there's only, I think, 2 places where you can stand like this, because everything else is completely full and cramped. So this animation shows the deployment mechanism. It's so this is approximately the volume of a standard container, so it can be transported by standard means on terrestrial grounds, and it has 6 petals, 2 and 4 basically, and there's a specific choreography how they open up. It has a main center space for people to, well, for the 2 people, for the crew together, or to eat, to hang out. It has a private space, which is also very important for psychological reasons. Also a workspace. The machinery of air and ventilation is quite loud, so it's quite important to think about how to reduce the noise and to create a little bit of more less noisier places. It has a fridge, trash compactor, a microwave oven. There's one control panel which actually controls the whole environmental system. Then there's one part which is the so-called wet compartment. Could be used as a laboratory, as a space for maintenance, for repair, and there's a tiny little so-called hygiene facility. That's what NASA always calls it. It has no shower, of course, because showers take a lot of water, which is not, well, you can't have that in space, actually. And very interesting, there's this so-called suit port. To prevent contamination, you have a double backpack. Basically, you step into the suit, and then you go on and walk on either Moon or Mars, or somewhere else. Here you can see how it's transported. It's a it's either on a truck, but what is also another specialty is that it actually has that space, that volume you would need, or you could bring to another planetary surface. So you see that 2 back-to-back actually fit into one of these, with these 6 diameter, into one of these heavy lift launchers. But then, as you know, a lot of times you build something, it's ready, then people start inhabiting it, and they do all the things different, or some things more different than you planned. So the wet compartment became the local mission control. You see in the back the flight controller, the commander, basically in that local mission control. The main space was the medical checkup and preparation before people would go into the simulation, because we built also what we didn't have in the beginning. We built this kind of suit port mock-up, and everybody needed to be checked. First of all, it was very hot there, and secondly, the suit was super heavy, like 35 kilos or so, with all the communications and the frame, so that nobody with too high blood pressure in the beginning could actually go on these missions. This is how you step in. So you see it's a good simulation of a real suit port. It's not then a real suit port, but you can start simulating, and then you learn what can you improve and how can you do it better, and with the next step you can improve. So here's René just detaching from the suit port. And we also had a Raman spectrometer for measuring taking geological probes, which were then some analysis has been done here in the astrobiology lab. So this is the workstation, the workspace, but you also see geological probes which were taken up through sampling. The rover was controlled via a gesture control, so you could, with simple arm movements, you could control the rover. And we also developed some of these tools you see here in this picture. That's me. And these astronaut rover cooperation, there was an exact procedure you had to follow, and these were compared to astronaut cooperation. There's some other pictures of sampling. And then we compared everything with underwater. So the habitat was not taken underwater, of course, but the actual cooperation between the rover and the astronaut, and the astronaut was taken underwater because we could simulate the moon with 1/6 gravity. On Mars, we would have to build a base, but we would have to take local resources. So this is the third prize we made in cooperation with ESA, actually in a NASA 3D printed habitat challenge in 2015. And this is all about taking local resources and using it for 3D printing of bases. So this was a method the ESA, European Space Agency, suggested. It's called lava casting. So you actually take the sand, you heat it up so that it's like lava and it's molten, and you can fill it into molds and slowly create the overall base. The second aspect was actually taking what's already there. So all these whitish parts are actually leftovers from previous missions or hardware parts which you would need to land, the hard parts here, the additional parts, and use it as a resource for building the habitat. So again, you could see that the Bioplex role model is still very present, or there are not so many ways of incorporating all these strict requirements. So you have crew quarters, you have the habitat, you have a laboratory, you have a greenhouse, and a docking port for a pressurized rover, which is a mobile caravan basically, or mobile research facility like a caravan. Another project which is right along that line, and because Dava Hive was more this conceptual stage, and we won a project which is called Regolith. So that is sintering regolith with solar light. Regolith is lunar or Martian sand, indigenous sand basically. So what we are doing here is actually taking simulant, sand simulant, lunar sand simulant, which has the same characteristics or similar characteristics as we would find on the moon, and sinter it into interlocking building elements. It's like Lego bricks basically, but a little bit more intelligence, built on the space filler geometry. We have developed a couple of geometries. What you can see here is a test where we actually take this sand in a large mobile printer to try and create these interlocking elements. There were all other tests also in vacuum, but it's quite a challenge to get the the printers right, and to get it into the vacuum or get the light right, so that it all is it's again a simulation of the lunar environment. This is the last project I'm showing. It's a greenhouse for Moon and Mars, and it's interesting because it touches on a couple of very urgent issues, like food and growing food in very dense spaces. We have built with 14 partners we have taken 2 containers and built inside a greenhouse, and the test site is Antarctica. It comprises of 2 parts. So the part where the entrance door is the so-called service section with a small laboratory and a lot of machinery, and the other part, the back part, is the actual greenhouse. So Antarctica is, I was lucky, I was in Antarctica last March through the Antarctic Biennale expedition. Antarctica is the closest you can come to space on Earth, I believe, because it has the most extreme temperatures, up to minus 80 degrees Celsius. It's a desert. It's very dry and very cold, and you can find a lot of actual Martian rocks there. And it has some other interesting features which are close to space. It's like the moon Europa, the Jupiter moon Europa. So that's why it's a good test site. This is here the interior, the service section, which we designed. So sometimes in the space project you only have a tiny little exercise to do, but the challenge is to fit it into a very complex system. And then this is the greenhouse. So we grow lettuce, Swiss chard, cucumbers, strawberries, some chives, and peppers, red peppers. And this is a picture of yesterday or 2 days back. So they've already managed to put the containers onto the platform. This is close to the Neumayer 3 station, which is the German research station in Antarctica. And it's when you think about the Antarctic continent, then it's right opposite, South Africa basically, and then inland, 2 hours flight. And so they built the platform last year, and they just installed the 2 containers, and they will now equip it with all the necessary items. And this is the other path. I forgot about this. It's growing as building, built to grow. It ties into food. It ties somehow, but it's more about biology and looking at biological paradigms. And we had a previous project, bionometics, but the most recent one was looking at growth parameters, and also looking at what we already have and how can we go beyond the state of the art. We looked at growth principles through the slime mold, at material systems, growing mycelium. We looked also at closed loop systems, at bioreactors, and of course at 3D printing and taking local resources. So we had 2 different 3D printers. And you might have seen the exhibition, some of you at least. And this was developed by Damian Minovsky, who's also a Prix Studio graduate. So he was in the core team of that project. And this is a hacking of MakerBot. And the interesting thing was were actually then the models and the prints you could do. So sometimes it's very difficult to understand, even for us, not for other people, how everything can come together. But we're slowly, I think, trying to connect, or we can connect the dots of the projects. We are still pursuing the line of biomimetics, and have gone a little bit further into bioreactors, a project which is called Living Architecture. And this is about, with a lot of synthetic biology and a lot of scientists and engineers, bringing together 3 types of bioreactors. One is a microbial fuel cell, one is a photobioreactor, and one is comprised of synthetic microbial consortia. So they're synthetic, artificially engineered microbes. What they should do is produce energy, clean the air, that's the photobioreactor, and take the phosphate from the gray water. And we built a prototype, which was basically is now in the laboratories of the University of the West England in Bristol for testing. And but the idea is to comprise all these 3 parts and create a partition wall for a household to treat the wastewater. So as a summary, our main concerns are always, how to deal with limited resources, how to make building spaces, systems self-sufficient. We'll think a lot about closed-loop systems, recycling, and then also minimal spaces, transformable spaces. And then it's also always about the people who will inhabit these systems. And when we think about space and the International Space Station, it's always about international and multicultural crews. And then when we have mastered all this and we will have cities like spaceships, then we probably, can also turn it around and create spaceships like cities. Thank you.
Very inspiring lectures, I have to say. And I have prepared some questions. I'm almost tempted to jump ahead to my 3rd or 4th question, which is really dedicated about the nature of the work that you're doing. But I think the whole purpose of this lecture series is to show students, but also external people coming here, that there is a lineage and a trajectory between what you do at university and what you do later on in your career. Even if with some ruptures or discrepancies, I really liked your diploma projects, to hear the background story from it, and then to see how the story went from there on and what you're doing today. So I think it is important to maybe start with the first question relating back to your time as a student. And I'd like to connect to where we left the last panel discussion. And I would be curious maybe to hear a little bit about the ideology and the mentality of that particular time when you were studying at the Angewandte in the early 90s or mid-90s with wolf pricks. And maybe some of the questions related to that is, why did you choose to study with wolf pricks? How do you remember that time at the Angewandte? I don't know who would like to start.
There's nothing to choose in the end.
Sorry? I don't even know if we need the microphones, because I think...
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Well, in my opinion, there was, you couldn't, there was nothing to choose for me. This was the only interesting option. At that time, I had already been at the Technical University. I came back from the Bartlett School, so then this was the only option to go for.
I didn't choose because I went back, because I was already at the university, but I was at the Hans Holland class, so I went back to my old class. But I chose him because I was at the summer academy, and this was, I think, 1 year or 2 years before. So it was a good coincidence for me that he came.
As we've also partly heard in your lectures, the kind of tasks that Wolf-Prix was inaugurating at that time were somewhat of an experimental nature. They were trying to find out who you were as an architect, or trying to put space into an experimental state. And I'm curious of how can these approaches be traced back to how can your own experiments be traced back to your studies? Do you see for yourself a connection about that, let's say, experimental task back as an early student career and what you're doing today? Is there a connection for you?
I was always very astonished because we are, I would say, very strongly connected with the body somehow. So the poor boys, and then also we as a team, and all, let's say, out of this surrounding, also Wolfgang Grilic, who had his office later on in Berlin, there was this kind of body and space, and how it's interacting was a big thematic. And maybe because we also did this period of, being our own client and using this city as a sketchbook, as I said before, really researching within the city, finding out what does inspire you to do something, and what does it mean, these leftover spaces, not nostalgic, but more about the background, So I think that this with Haut und Hahn, jumping into architecture, was something some of our people in the studio, the starting of Wolf-Prix had. And we had some projects, Raumabdruck, or the first projects with flying objects and swimming objects. And he wanted us at the beginning, somehow to build or to do more object elements, I think, and try out with material somehow. So maybe.
Barbara, how is it for you? Because with there, and now that we're talking, I'm also seeing this connection to early experiments of housing per co, minimal dwellings, even the idea within your diploma project. Is that something that is still in continuation for you somewhere in the back of your head?
The minimal housing?
Well, small defined spaces, as an environment of living.
I think yes, because it's one of the main topics, architectural topics we deal with. But it wasn't my, I think it was more, it was all very processual or so. I wasn't really I wasn't thinking I want to do something with space, not at all. It was more an investigation into something I was interested in, so how we will live in the future, would we live like this, or in which kind of relationships or settings, and then what would that mean for architecture. And it was really like that I somehow was, through this investigation and talking to other people, and we were speculating, of course, other people from the class about the moon and Mars, that I started, that I went to the Austrian Space Agency and just started asking about, how can I build on the moon, or what do I do then, or something like that. So but I wasn't, but I was always interested in these social systems and actions and how they could form the space. And I think that's also, that's what Prix was very much pushing us always towards the boundaries and to cross these boundaries.
Maybe we move now from you two being as a student to the other side of the academic sphere, where both of you have been engaging as mentors and teachers. And I would be also curious to hear how how has teaching early in your career have influenced what you were doing on the professional side of the practice? What was the feedback between teaching, studios, and what you were doing in the office? Or maybe another way to ask, was teaching a ground of experimentation?
Well, for me, I have to say with these space design studios, it was definitely a ground of experimenting and seeing because we did a lot of we combined biomimetics with space and did a project actually for the European Space Agency with students about folding different foldable structures which came from biology and which could become shelters on the moon. And we did shelters for Mars, so I think it was always, or some other extreme environments. So I think in that way it started creating this this basis, and also this dialogue then with the students and with the other. We always, I mean, I had a great network then through the International Space University, so I always tried to bring in experts. So that was always this platform for conversation.
I think I had a very different situation because I was studying teaching for technical university, where I tried out kind of methods because we were dealing a lot with design process. And therefore, I did programs where I also tried to steer or to herausfordern, you know, the people to start with their own wishes or to feel their own interests somehow. I tried out certain things which was interesting. At the class of Wolf, this research or to start your own, you know, program was not possible, or it was not the wish, or it was not the tradition somehow of the studio to do so. But for me, the whole part of computer generating, what programs can do, and all these elements, because I did my diploma in hand drawing, and because 2 years before the first computers came, there was Daniel Dögel and Harit Shakuri. They were completely working with these computers, and we also did a bit, you know, but it was not. I didn't jump in this kind of thematic because I was nearly finished. But of course, afterwards, Christian Dögel sold me an indie machine and taught me how to do MicroStation. So this was after, but all these, you know, generating things with the computer, and it was very much, I think, for me, also at this university discussion, what was going on there, and of course, communication about thematics. Yeah, so I think it's an interesting and always befruchtendes situation, you know, to have this academic feedback, you know.
Maybe slowly I would like to tackle a little bit about the experimental tendencies in although different, but both in your projects and in your work, because what's somehow quite fascinating is that throughout the projects in both lectures, I think there was a strong consistency for experimentation, for the experimental nature of projects. And I'm curious how, if you always had the desire to challenge the discipline from within, to try to push the boundaries of, let's say, what constitutes or defines architecture, if that would be one question. And the second one would be, how would you describe what keeps up this consistency beyond your personal, let's say, discipline and interest? How difficult is it to avoid compromises in projects, or to be smart about compromises and to include them in the project so that they don't, let's say, hurt the project in its nature? So I'm curious to find out about why both of you work on this really thin line of let's say, expanding the boundaries of architecture.
Couldn't resist. We couldn't resist. But I think it's difficult, and I think that we maybe have very different situations because Barbara is very strong in a kind of research situation, and we are in a kind of like building situation. You know, that's it's a bit of more or less academic, but not in this strong, you know, path. So it's about realization, and there, of course, the circumstances are very specific. I said at the moment we are also doing like installations. We all doing installations, or like now also exhibitions is also a possibility, you know, to try out with material, with a certain kind of. But let's say, I always say atmospheric situations, but for me it has a lot to do with what space means for our society dealing with all these new medias, you know, losing the body somehow, and also maybe losing more this kind of communicating together, you know, directly. You have so much, you know, virtual in communication, and I believe that we cannot give up our body. And I think and therefore this combination, you know, of medias and though space that has a kind of specificness, it has this kind of atmospheric, I think, you know, quality, I think is very important. In the exhibition situation, I always think it's also interesting, you know, to put a kind of thematic into a context. Mm-hmm. And it also helps, you know, being more aware, being better in learning. We all know that this kind of ambient, you know, if the ambient is that also being more creative, being better in understanding and learning is positively influenced. So this is also a kind of testing zone on the one hand side. On the other hand side, at the moment we are also dealing in this urban conceptual things, you know, that are, but always, I think, connected for us, because the scales for us was never thematic, because it's interesting to have different scales in the studio, and I think it's good if you have different areas, and then maybe you make it possible. It can also be the academic, and it can be a building of housing and research or doing experimental projects. But you need a balance of different paths that you can, I think, survive if you want to realize.
Maybe a question just in connection. Is the scale of an office, the number of employees, the amount of work that one has, something that limits or expands the possibilities of experimental working? Meaning,
I mean, the question is even what you mean with experimental.
Well,
I think it's very broad. It's a very, but however,
Can I answer this?
Yeah.
What is experimental?
No, I don't think that size matters in that sense, because I mean, today you can really, you create a network, or you create partnerships with other offices, with other institutions, with other researchers, and then you just collaborate. And I think that that this is, and it's also probably more interesting, and you can vary your partners, and so in that sense, I don't think it really matters for experimental work. On the contrary, it allows you to actually explore more fields and go into many different directions, and be more flexible and faster in responding to your interests or to your environment and context.
Therefore, I was asking him what he means with experimental, because if he also says we are doing experimental things and we are trying, you know, to build, I just can say if you want to realize, or maybe Ernst, if you're different opinion, I think if you want to realize in an experimental way, of course you also can cooperate with people, but you also need some people in your own office. You know, you need a certain stock of people that with whom you develop and do the project. You know, for realization. So not if I make not to experiment in sense of, you know, thinking about concept things. It can be a very small group. I mean, the question is how many people you think. If it's a big building, of course. I mean, we know from the project we did for Bad Villa. I mean, and it was, I think, a very complex and interesting building because it would have been a new kind of cave-like interior Hallenbad situation. It's a lot of work, and I think you want to be directly in this connection, you know, of developing these details, all these drawings. It's a lot of work to just produce all these drawings.
I mean, if we talk already about collaboration and maybe even interdisciplinarity, I think we see a lot of these in both of your projects in the sense of collaboration as we know it, but to me more interesting, there's also a source of influence from outside domains of architecture, obviously which enter both of your works. For example, Marie-Therese, if I think of the installation at the Winterpalais or the sound objects, I immediately think of some sort of an of artists or a very open artistic approach to design that influences the architectural creation. Or in your case, Barbara, I think that the scientific dogma of your educational background, which is again an extension of the architectural realm, influences the work. So my question would be, what are things outside of, and I don't want to draw a line what architecture is, but I do see that in both of the works there is something entering from the outside that influences you or inspires you, that also shapes somehow what you're doing. And I've tried to describe it, but maybe I'd like to hear more from you. What are other inspirational sources for your own work?
Well, I think in general it's that architecture, or when you study architecture, you are exposed to a certain way of thinking, and this is, and in my opinion, the way I've come across other disciplines and working with scientists and so on, that this, what you learn during your studies, how to think and how to approach a topic or a problem or a project, it very much defines the way you work and the way you live and the way you think. And only if you let yourself get exposed to other disciplines or the arts, wherever, and you can also find that lots of scientists, they have a good sense for the arts, or they are artists themselves as well. So then it's you can somehow overcome that original, how can I say, way of thinking or of conceptual thinking. But in the end, I think if I would task an architect to, I don't know, to do a specific work, and a scientist or an engineer or a scientist, they would all approach it completely differently, and that's a distinction. Even if they work on the same project. So to me, architecture is not, you always think, okay, an architecture builds an architect builds houses, but that's just one possibility. Yeah, I think it's more, and I see that in all these space projects, what we as architects and designers can bring into that project is the way we think and we look at this kind of, we have you always can switch from the overall perspective of the whole project to the detail and back, and this is what we have been trained for. And also combine it with, contextualize it and set it within a cultural context and so on and so forth. And that's a very unique, in my opinion, a very unique capability, which is a generic, it could be applied to many fields.
I just have this experience, and I agree with you that I think that as an architect, for me, I would express it like this, that you are like trained to put ideas, concepts, program together and to put it into a spatial context, the result is some kind of a spatial construction where you put all these different elements together. And for me, as we were always a bit involved, with art and art production or art in public space, I was also in juries like this, or we did projects. And there was also, I remember, an interview with Stella Rohlig. She did once for Ö1. We were still, as poor boys, and she were asking us, she said she thinks that we have a very artistic practice because we are like, when we did this kind of one-to-one projects here in Sale, number 7, and things within the city and the chair project, because it was a lot driven just by the process and so on. And I thought that was interesting because it, because there was not an aim, it was just, to follow the moment and follow and looking at that what's there, valuing the things that are there, taking them serious, taking things serious, taking a broken chair serious. The same I also take serious now, a certain context or surrounding of something. I think we're very, we see a lot when we look at the site or a program or things like this. And though we always feel like an architect, and I think we also, if we do installations, for us we are always doing it as an architect. And I think even if you have a, for example, in competition for eine Platzgestaltung, I think an architect always would do it in a very different way than an artist. Though there are artists that are interested in the spatial constellations, and there are architects that are interested in, let's say, artistic interventions, but they think differently. And that's also interesting. And so that's very interesting, this kind of.
I think we can see this also today with graduates leaving from the Angewandte, because I think that there is more and more the kind of tendency that graduates realize their capabilities and they try to utilize this in various fields. Maybe a large amount still retires back after a certain while to architecture and buildings and other scales of building, but we also have a lot of graduates who work on completely different fields, and I think the very last session of this lecture series actually invites only graduates who are utilizing their knowledge but for different fields. My next question is actually a proposition, and I fully take responsibility for maybe being wrong, but I tried to find some sort of a common ground that somehow, almost even in a word, could potentially combine both of your works, and what came to my mind was gravity, because I think that gravity somehow plays a defining role in both of your work. Something that appears very generic and everybody has to deal with, as architects, of course, especially, but I had the feeling that in a lot of your projects, Marie-Therese, there was an attempt to defy gravity in a way that architecture looks almost ephemeral or very lightweight or reaching out, and it creates kind of momentum. And Barbara, I think in your work, gravity plays a completely different role because it becomes a very strong project constraint in terms of construction, in terms of usability of space, and so forth. And the question is a simple one: is there a fascination spatially with gravity, or how would you see maybe each other's work relating to this theme?
Well, the first thing I would say now is I'm fascinated with zero, with no gravity, because I think that's the optimal space for architects to work in, because there's no we're not bound to gravity anymore. We don't have directions, the floor, the ceiling, right, left. It's all equal, and it's also from an experiential perspective. You can experience all three dimensions equally, and then it's like this kind of maybe what is the black box for the artist or the actors, and so that it's zero gravity is the ideal space for the architects.
But you cannot do yoga.
You can.
It's interesting because it creates a kind of omnidirectionality, no? I think that space, as we know it, I think that the idea of the horizon and gravitation sets a lot in how we think about space. But it's interesting if you talk about zero.
And you can just start, do anything you want. You can put your horizon where you want. You can,
No, but it's because for me it's very difficult to imagine, how it would be. And I think that Barbara, who is dealing a lot with these kind of situations, and we're speaking with a lot of people, she will have a different approach already to this kind of question, how you feel in this kind of zero. Because at the moment, if you tell me, I would like to try it out, but I wouldn't like to live in it, because I like to feel the body somehow, But I was telling, I see body and stay, and we are very, we like music that is touching our body, and we like, so you have to invite me for a trip.
Okay, maybe.
But then we lost the question, I think.
Well, I think it was how,
Yeah, we all like to fly.
Okay, the next question quickly tries to somehow give meaning to the title of the series, which means built, unbuilt, and the question. I would separate the question here because I think that. To you, Marie-Therese, the question is that, of course, architects do a lot of work and not all of the work can be realized. And the question to you would be how that unrealized work actually fuels maybe the next project, or how one idea gets tested over and over in projects till some form of it can be realized. And the question to you, Barbara, would be, I think that the idea of a time frame for you is a very different one than for an architect, because if an architect works over a certain time frame from the first idea to the completion of a building, you are envisioning probably a much longer time frame. It's almost like doing pioneering work for maybe, I don't know how many years ahead, where some of this research and installations will actually travel to outer space or other planets. So these would be, maybe we...
Start. Yeah,
as you like.
I think what the interesting thing about these long time frames is that you can actually create a vision, and you can, when you live in today's societies, wherever in the world, it's always about the now, and it's everything is within short time frames, and nobody allows him herself to think about these long-term visions. It's like in politics. It's if you try to convince somebody for a long-term vision, they all they completely, well, not even shy away but run away. So I think that's something which is a good. It's just a good training to keep yourself somehow inspired. This kind of vision, to create this vision, and then along these long time frames in these shorter periods. That a research project typically is 3 years. It's like probably building a large building or so. I don't know where, depending if you build it in China or somewhere else. But so there's always these little steps on that long way. So I think that's it's you can't get frustrated with this long vision, but you can get inspired. It's still in that way that you can get inspired because there are these little steps.
I think also also if you're not working this kind of research thematic, it's important to have visions in your head. And I think like doing competitions or things like this, it's not always, or actually not very often, asked the really visionary situation. We have a lot of frameworks already, but for us, of course, we try, to all these parameters we were talking about of proposing, spaces that can be, taken by the people for their own wishes and this kind of, these white spots, this flexibility. Of course, we try to imply this in any project we are doing, and all the projects are hanging in our office, and it happened often already, that you take fragments, even in different scales that suddenly are found then in something smaller, furniture installation, whatever, and the other way around, like the audio lounge, for example, we had a model and Schichtmodell, and it looked so wonderful, and we put it and said, if this is a building of 50 meters height, because this inside outside, of course, was also very interesting as a body of building. So it's all, we like to have everything around us, and therefore our studio is very full.
Visual inspiration.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, maybe last two questions before we give to the audience, and we can finally hit the bar outside. But I think the next question is quite relevant. I'd like to quote Zaha Hadid, who once outlined that as a woman she had to work twice as hard to be recognized in a field dominated, probably back then, primarily by men. And today I think that architecture faculties have growing numbers in female students, which hopefully reflects that dissolvement of a gender-specific professional role model. But I'm curious, throughout your career, how have you witnessed this tension? Was it difficult as a woman to express your opinions or to achieve certain goals? Or did this never play a role in your careers?
It's not always that obvious. I mean, it's when you sit as the only woman in with all these managers from Airbus, ESA, and I don't know, these big companies on a table, then you after 5-10 minutes or so, you somehow get a sense that okay, you are the only woman and they're all men. But it's very hard to describe. It's more about I think that what I feel is that the way women approach work or life in general is different to men. I mean, we have been discussing this, especially in my contribution to women in aerospace Europe, and one of the an Austrian, Pascal Ehrenfreund, who leads the German Aerospace Center, DLR, she said, you know, it already starts with applications. You know, you see this list, and it's a good job, professorship of I don't know, landscape architecture, let's say, whatever it is, and then there are these kind of qualifications you have to do, and that's a very typical, very good example that so women would check all these items and do the checkbox. Can I do this? Can I do this? Can I do this? Men typically they just look at the title and the salary, and the rest they say can do, whatever, you know. So it's a very and I have I mean, my brother did the same thing, and he didn't get the job he wanted, but he got a different good job. I mean, you know, he applied for the job of his boss. But basically, it's a completely different approach, and this is, and so it's not something which manifests in these specific meetings, apart from this kind of that you become aware of it. But it's more I don't know, more subtle, I would say. So there's, you know, nobody ever said to me, oh, you're a woman and this is an all-men's club, you can't attend. But
I mean, I was always working together, you know, with mixed situations and never had problems in working together. But I would say we need more women clients. It's the next step our society has to do, because this is, you know, now we have a lot of, professional architects, women architects, but we also need the clients, because this kind of how these channels work, you know, this is, and this you also feel if you're sitting in juries of competitions, for example, or things like this, or you know, where you're trying to acquire, you know, getting, and I think there it's not. There are sometimes strange situations, just because also, yeah, just there's a kind of different situation. So more women clients.
Okay.
But where can we educate these women clients?
Good question. Maybe we open up with 2 or 3 more questions from the audience. Or if there are no questions, we hit the buffet and the bar immediately. But would you be okay with a few questions if there are any?
We're okay, but we're also very hungry.
Who has still some questions or topics that weren't debated?
I have a question. Barbara. I think I'm loud enough.
I can hear you. I
have a
can hear
strong voice.
Okay.
So I was really curious when you showed this photograph of Earth and Mars and Moon, and basically said the extension of your spatial investigation from sort of Mother Earth onto was kind of a continuity. And you know, there is obviously the other that you associate with outer space. And there is obviously the attraction in that. And I was just wondering, the way you were talking about this idea of continuity, of sort of extending space, of really, in a way, colonizing space beyond the Earth, it had a slightly sort of cynical moment in it. And it's like, do you really feel that this sort of space continuity is something which is, you know, something that you find as a parameter to your practice, and don't you ever want to keep the otherness as a sort of consolidate, not consolidate, but as the main parameter to sort of engage with? Huh? I mean, rather than to sort of look at similarity, kind of look at the otherness of it, at the dissimilarity. And I guess when you were talking about sort of the spatial analogs, right, and sort of working on Earth and trying to sort of create conditions that were very similar to the testing, or that were testing situations that were very similar to the sort of conditions on Mars. Somehow the analog works, right? But does it really work when you then extend it onto the other planet and beyond the Earth's configuration?
well, on a technical level, the analog works in connection with other analogs. So you have different features and you bring it all together. So, but and on the other, it depends. Not sure, which there are many answers or many paths I could follow now. I think that, it's inevitable that we will, at one point, leave the Earth with more people than right now. Right now, we have this international outpost, and there's only 6 people constantly, permanently inhabiting this international outpost, the International Space Station. And I would find it absurd to say, okay, we are here on our planet, and this is this kind of mysterious otherness, the otherworldly, and I think that I don't know. It would be, to me, it would be a little bit strange if we wouldn't want to, or we do actually, and we want to explore and just to step over whatever boundaries we think are there. But I think at the same time, there's the universe is so big. It's not that little step would make a difference to what you're saying, to still leave this otherness.
Yeah, I don't think it's a question of mystery, but even just going to Japan and this complete otherness
Yes.
as an element that is of value in a way, and that actually specifically in the process of design or inhabitation or forming a partnership, right, is something that actually is a great value, right? It is a fact of difference and a matter of interaction that needs to be negotiated rather than a given. That's what I wonder. Is that kind of negotiation something that somehow matters to you, and if so, in what way? Right? Or is this really this idea of continuity? I just said, yes, we go from here and we just expand, and then from there we go beyond.
I think now I understand the question better. No, I think I see what you mean. No, I don't think. I think there's a spatial continuity, and it's a way of looking at it, because we always. I think why I say I'd like to not see this line is, first of all, it's not there, and secondly, it's because we always think we are here, and then that is far out there, but in reality it's just a 10 minutes ride on a rocket. So it's close. And I think it is about the continuity, but it doesn't, like Japan or Antarctica, it doesn't give away the otherness just because it's all around us. So it's both. It's continuous and otherness, otherworldly.
I'd like to make the proposal maybe to carry on the next or upcoming questions to the bar and the buffet. And I would like to thank both of you for being here today and showing us your work and having this talk with me. Thank you very much.